A native woman was stealing eggs. Then, when the cowboy caught her and said, "Come and bring your kids," the first light of day slid across the San Simon Valley, turning the red dust to gold and the air to fire. Damon Pike had been gathering eggs when he noticed the straw disturbed, the faint crunch of movement beneath the low roof. He stopped, hand tightening around the worn grip of his Colt. "Don't move," he said, voice calm as dry thunder. From the shadow rose a woman, dark hair tangled with straw, eyes black as obsidian. She knelt among broken shells, 2 eggs clenched in her palms. One had already cracked, yellow, dripping through her fingers. "I only need 2, she said in halting English. "For breakfast. For my children." Damon's gaze shifted toward the doorway. 2 small faces peeked through the slats, thin, dirt-streaked, frightened but unblinking. For a long moment, nothing stirred but the dust between them. Then, slowly, Damon lowered his gun. Morning spread across the valley like a slow breath. Beyond the coop, the land opened into miles of brittle grass and red rock that shimmered under the rising sun. A dry wind swept through the mesquite, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and the faint sweetness of sage. San Simon was a quiet wound in the earth where the living held on mostly out of habit. Damon Pike lived alone on the edge of that valley, in a cabin, half swallowed by wind and time. The paint had peeled to gray, and the porch sagged as if exhausted from holding him up all these years. He was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-beaten skin and eyes the color of weathered brass. A thin scar drew down from his right temple to the corner of his jaw, the only reminder of the cavalry days he never spoke of. He'd left the army after San Carlos, after seeing too much that could not be justified. Since then, he had lived as the land did, quiet, scorched, and stubbornly alive. Now he stood in the yard, facing the woman who had stolen his eggs. She rose slowly from the straw, brushing dust from her deerskin skirt. Her wrists were thin, but her gaze held a calm strength that unsettled him more than a drawn gun. "I don't steal for myself," she said, as if explaining a law of nature, "only to feed them. I gathered those hens from hawks and coyotes for 2 years." Damon replied, "You might have asked." She looked toward the children again, a girl and a boy, no older than 6 and 4, standing barefoot at the threshold. The girl's small hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. "People don't listen when I ask," she said simply. Damon studied her the way she stood, neither pleading nor proud. Her clothes were worn but carefully mended. A leather strap crossed her shoulder, holding a small pouch. Her voice, though rough, carried an echo of schooling. "You speak English well," he noted. She nodded once. "A missionary taught me, long ago." Before they burned the church, something in Damon's chest tightened. He holstered his gun, rubbing his palm along the wooden grip. "You've got names for them, Noka," she said, pointing to the girl. "And Tyon. They look hungry." "They are." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the groan of the wind through the barn's slats. Damon sighed, then motioned toward the cabin. "There's bread on the stove. Bring them." Asha hesitated, the first crack in her composure, then whispered a few soft words in Apache. The children followed her cautiously, steps barely stirring the dust. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee grounds and cedar smoke. Damon poured water into a pot, the sound echoing in the still air. The children sat at the edge of a wooden bench, eyes wide, waiting for permission to breathe. Asha stood by the door, her hands clasped tight. Damon set 3 plates on the table and said, without looking up, "If you need a place to stay, there's work that needs doing. You help. You eat." Her reply was quiet but firm. "I can work. I plant. Sow. Ride. Whatever you ask." He nodded once. "Then start with the garden. The soil's mean, but maybe it'll listen to you." Outside, the wind picked up again, swirling red dust through the sunlight. somewhere in that shifting air. Something unseen began to change, the faint stir of two lives crossing paths neither had meant to find. The next morning broke under a veil of thin cloud, softening the harsh light that usually struck San Simon bare. Damon led the way to the garden behind the cabin, a rough patch fenced with old wire and stubborn cactus roots. The soil there was red and cracked, like a wound that never healed. Asha followed in silence, her long dark braid brushing her shoulder. Noka and Tayan trailed after her, still clutching the half-crumbled bread from last night's supper. Damon pointed with his shovel. "We'll start with that side. It gets more sun." Asha knelt without a word. Her hands, small but callous, sank into the dirt with a familiarity that surprised him. She turned the soil slowly, like she was waking something asleep. He watched her work for a while, the rhythmic scrape of her hoe steady as a heartbeat. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded. "My mother taught me. She said the earth knows kindness if you touch it gently." Damon leaned on his shovel. "Does it still listen?" "Not always," she said, glancing toward the horizon. "But sometimes it remembers." The wind picked up, rolling through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the smell of rain that would never come. By noon, sweat streaked their faces. Noka had gathered stones into neat little piles, while Tayan followed a grasshopper, laughing for the first time since Damon had seen him. The sound startled them both, a small, bright thing cutting through the stillness. Damon found himself smiling. A brief, involuntary act he quickly hid behind a sip from his canteen. When they stopped for a meal, Asha sat apart, her children beside her. She tore the bread in three, giving the largest piece to Noka. Damon crouched near the fence post, pretending to check a loose wire but listening to the soft hum of Asha's voice. She was singing low, melodic, in a language older than the dust. The tune drifted through the yard like smoke, wrapping itself around the quiet spaces between them. That night, Damon lay awake on his cot, staring at the wooden beams above. He hadn't heard a voice like that in years, one that made the silence feel less like loneliness. He thought of the scar along his jaw. End of the day, he turned his back on the cavalry after seeing what men could do when they stopped seeing others as human. When the wind shifted, he heard her again outside, near the fire pit, singing softly while mending a shirt. He rose, hesitated, then stepped to the doorway. "You don't have to stay up," he said quietly. Asha didn't look up. "I sleep light. The children sometimes wake." He nodded, standing a moment too long. The firelight flickered across her face, strong features softened by weariness. "You sing in Apache," he said. "It helps them dream of the mountains." She murmured, "So they don't forget." "Do you miss it?" She looked up then, eyes catching the fire. "Every day." He wanted to say something that he, too, missed a home that no longer existed, but the words refused him. Instead, he said, "It's a good song." Asha smiled faintly, the first he had seen. "It's about the wind that chose to stay." He frowned. "The wind, in our stories," she explained. "The wind belongs to no one. It moves where it wants. But once, it saw a dying tree and stayed beside it until green came back. Some say that's foolish. And you," she met his gaze, unflinching, "I think it's brave." Damon's throat tightened. He looked away, to the horizon, fading into night. "Brave," he echoed, the word barely more than breath. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the fire crackled and the coyotes called from the hills. Then Damon turned back toward the cabin, muttering, "Good night, Asha." She nodded once. "Good night, Damon Pike." Inside, the house felt different, not less lonely, but quieter in another way, as if something unseen had settled into place. Outside, the wind shifted again, and for the first time in many years, it didn't sound empty. Weeks slipped by under the slow rhythm of desert days. The summer sun burned away hesitation, leaving only what could endure. By then, Asha and her children had folded into Damon's life like a song learned by heart, unexpected, yet impossible to forget once heard. Each morning began the same: the hiss of the coffee pot, the creak of the porch, and the low hum of Asha's voice as she swept the yard. Noka helped Damon water the struggling bean vines, while Tayan ran barefoot between the corral and the well, chasing lizards and laughter. The place that had once felt hollow now echoed with life. Damon, who'd long ago stopped expecting anything to grow crops, friendship, or trust, found himself waiting for the sound of Asha's footsteps, for her quiet nod at dawn. She worked with the precision of someone who had rebuilt everything from ashes. Her hands were rarely still, if not tending the soil. She was patching shirts, shaping bread, or smoothing her children's hair. One evening, as the horizon bled into violet, Damon found her beside the corral, stitching a torn saddle strap. He leaned against the post. "You fix leather too?" Asha didn't look up. "Leather, cloth, fences. What breaks can be mended if you still care enough." He watched her fingers move deftly in the fading light. "Not everything mends," he said quietly. Asha glanced at the scar running along his jaw. "Maybe not the way it was," she said, "but even broken things can hold together if you tie them right." Her words stayed with him long after she went inside. That night, Damon opened a small wooden chest beneath his bed, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were medals, a frayed cavalry sash, and a letter written by a woman whose grave he could no longer visit. He folded the letter again, slower this time, and closed the chest. The next day, a wagon rolled down from Red Hollow. Caleb Boone, the blacksmith, sat in the driver's seat with worry carved into his face. His young son lay on the boards behind him, burning with fever. "I heard you had medicine," Caleb said, desperation cracking his voice. "The doc's gone to Tombstone. I got nowhere else." Aisha stepped forward, calm as ever. "Bring him inside." She ground herbs in a clay bowl, mixed them with pine resin, and pressed the paste against the boy's chest. Damon watched as her steady hands moved with care that seemed older than the desert itself. By nightfall, the fever broke. Caleb wept quietly by the door. "I don't know how to thank you," Aisha only said. "You already did by coming." Word of the blacksmith's son spread through the town by week's end. For the first time, the whispers about the Indian woman on Pike's Land carried something other than disdain. Women began to ride out to the ranch, one asking for salve, another for stitches. Aisha never refused anyone. One afternoon, Damon returned from town with the wagon empty and his jaw tight. She saw it before he spoke. "They wouldn't buy." He shook his head, said, "They don't want trouble tied to my name." Asha's expression didn't change. "Trouble can't stay long where work is honest." He gave a short laugh, tired, without humor. "You make it sound easy. It's not," she said softly. "But neither is living without purpose." Later that evening, she found him mending a fence post, his hands rough from work. The air shimmered with heat, and cicadas filled the silence. "Why did you leave the army?" she asked. Damon didn't stop hammering. "Because I was tired of being told who deserved to die." She watched him a long time, then said, "You chose to stay kind. That's rarer than bravery." When the hammer slipped and struck his thumb, he cursed under his breath. Asha laughed a low, rich sound that startled them both. Damon looked up, blinking in disbelief, and for a heartbeat. The air between them warmed in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. That night, after the children were asleep, Damon sat by the doorway polishing his old revolver, more out of habit than need. Aisha passed by, holding a blanket. "Do you ever use it?" she asked. "Not unless I have to." She paused, eyes catching the dull gleam of metal. "Then you are different from most men I've met." He set the revolver down. "You ever think about leaving? Maybe there's a place less cruel than this valley." Aisha looked past him, toward the dark horizon where lightning flickered far away. "No place is kind," she said, "but this one is quiet, and quiet is enough for now." He wanted to tell her that her voice had already made this place more than quiet, that it had made it alive again. But he didn't. Some truths were too fragile to speak out loud. Days turned into months, and though neither reached for the other, something invisible had begun to hold them together, not by desire alone, but by the shared understanding of those who had both lost too much. The wind moved softer through the valley, and even the dust seemed to rise slower, as if the land itself had learned to breathe again. Autumn came early that year, sharp winds rolling through the valley, shaking the cottonwoods bare. The light turned thinner, colder. Damon noticed how the mornings carried a silence that felt heavier than usual, the kind that came before something broke. He was loading sacks of corn into the wagon when the mail rider stopped at his gate, dust-streaked and tight-lipped. "Message from Fort Lowell," the man said, handing him a folded sheet. Damon read it once, then again, jaw-locking. When he returned to the cabin, Asha was kneeling near the hearth, braiding Noka's hair while Tayan carved a stick with a dull knife. Damon hesitated in the doorway. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. "What is it?" she asked. He set the paper on the table. "A report. The army's cleared the southern hills. Your people," his voice caught, "they're gone." Asha. For a moment, she didn't move. The braid slipped from her fingers. Her face went pale. Then still, too still. Noka looked up, confused, and Tayan pressed closer to her leg. Aisha stood slowly, hands trembling. "You mean all of them?" Damon nodded once. "They called it relocation. But I've seen what that means." The words hit her like stones. She turned away, gripping the table edge as if to stay upright. The room seemed to shrink around the sound of her breathing ragged, shallow. Then it broke. She covered her face, a low cry tearing out, raw and animal. "I left them," she whispered. "I ran while they stayed to fight. I thought I could come back when it was safe." Her voice shook. "I should have died with them." Damon crossed the room in 2 steps. He didn't speak, and didn't reach for her at first, just stood beside her until her sobs softened into trembling silence. Then he said quietly, "Don't talk like that. They died for their land," she said, looking up at him with eyes full of ash. "And I'm here, sowing, planting, pretending this is home." "You chose to live," he said. "There's no shame in that." She shook her head. "I betrayed them." "No," he said, more firmly this time. "You carried them with you. Every time you plant something, every song you sing, that's them still living." Asha closed her eyes, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Damon reached out and set his hand over hers. It was the first time he had ever touched her without caution. They stood that way for a long while, 2 survivors held together not by comfort, but by the simple need to not collapse. That night, the wind turned hard again. Damon stepped out to tie the barn doors, lantern light trembling across the field. From the ridge, faint glows flickered, too many to be campfires. He froze. Men, torches. He moved quickly back inside. "Asha," he said sharply, "get the children to the back room. Now." Her eyes widened, but she obeyed. Through the cracks in the shutters, Damon saw figures approaching 5, maybe 6, walking with the unsteady swagger of men full of drink and hate. He heard them before he saw them clearly. "Come out," Pike, a voice called, thick with liquor. "Heard you've got yourself a red-skinned whore and her bastards." Laughter followed, ugly, fearless. Damon's jaw tightened. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The wind whipped his coat around him, dust curling through the torchlight. "I told you to stay off my land," he said. His voice was low, steady. One of the men spat into the dirt. "We don't take kindly to your kind here. Pike ain't right." mixing blood. Go home. Or what another sneered. You'll shoot us. Damon's eyes flicked over them, all familiar faces from Red Hollow farmers. Drifters. Men who'd nodded to him once in passing. I don't want blood on this ground, he said, but I'll spill it if I have to. Asha watched through the narrow crack in the wall. Heart hammering. Noka clung to her arm. Tayan's small body shook against her side. She whispered in Apache. Half prayer, half promise. One man lunged forward, swinging his torch. Damon struck first, a single blow that dropped him into the dust. The torch shattered, flames licking at the dry grass. Damon kicked it aside, raised the rifle butt, and leveled his voice. Last chance. For a second, no one moved. Then, one by one, they backed away, muttering, cursing, disappearing into the darkness that had birthed them. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Damon stood breathing hard, the rifle shaking faintly in his hands. Aisha stepped out from the doorway. Her face glowed in the dying light, pale and fierce. They'll come again, she said quietly. Then I'll be here, Damon answered. She looked at him for a long time, then said, You could have killed them. I've done enough killing, he said. In the silence that followed, the wind carried only the smell of burnt grass and iron, somewhere behind them. The children began to cry softly, not from fear, but from release. Damon lowered the rifle, staring at the horizon until his heartbeat steadied. When he turned back, Asha was still watching him. Between them, no words were needed. Everything grief, defiance, gratitude was already spoken in the space their eyes held. And for the first time in years, Damon Pike prayed not to God, but to the fragile thing that had taken root between them. Dawn broke over San Simon Valley with a light too soft for what had happened. The grass was still blackened near the fence line where the torches had burned out, and the air smelled faintly of ash. Damon stood alone on the porch, hat in hand, watching smoke coil upward and vanish. He had barely slept. Each sound of the wind against the shutters had felt like boots returning. Yet when the sun rose, the valley looked peaceful, almost innocent again, as if the land refused to remember. Inside, Aisha was tending to the children. Noka stirred cornmeal into a pot while Tayan hummed the song about the wind. Their faces were calm now, though their mother's eyes still held the silver edge of sleeplessness. When Damon stepped inside, she turned. They'll talk about this, she said quietly. They already have, he replied. Word spreads fast when men run from a fight. Asha searched his face. You don't regret it, he shook his head. I've lived too long doing nothing. Last night, I think I finally stood for something that mattered. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once stolen his eggs. You stood for me, she said. I stood for what's right, he corrected. Then softer. And maybe for you too. Asha's gaze lingered on him. Unreadable. Then she smiled. Faint as dawn, light on dust. You can admit both. Damon Pike. He almost laughed a low, weary sound that came from somewhere deep. You always have to be right. Don't you know? She said, eyes softening, just alive. By mid-morning, the clatter of hooves echoed from the road. Damon reached for his rifle, but when the wagon came into view, it was led by Caleb Boone and his wife, Martha. Behind them trailed two other women from Red Hollow, their bonnets drawn tight against the wind. Martha Boone climbed down first, arms full of folded quilts. We heard what happened, she said, and we're not here for trouble. We're here for her. Asha froze in the doorway, not sure whether to flee or bow. Martha stepped closer, her eyes warm but determined. You saved my boy. Folks might be slow to remember good deeds, but not forever. Caleb nodded. Half the town's talking different now. Those men brought shame on all of us. Ain't right what they did. The other women placed bundles on the porch bread. Herbs. A small sack of coffee. You keep this. One said, and if anyone gives you more trouble, you send word. Asha swallowed hard, her throat thick. For a long time, she couldn't speak. Then she simply said, "Thank you." When the wagons left, the dust trailed behind them, like a pale ribbon, twisting in the wind. Damon turned to her. "You see, not everyone's rotten." Asha nodded slowly. Maybe kindness just needed somewhere to return to. He looked at her, then really looked, and realized that her words weren't about the town at all. They were about him. That evening, they sat together outside, the children already asleep. The sky stretched vast and violet above them, stars pricking through like shy promises. The wind was gentler tonight, as if listening. Asha held her knees close, her shawl drawn tight. "When I was little," she said, "my mother told me the world has two kinds of people, those who take and those who tend. I used to think I'd be the first kind to take whatever I could to survive. But lately," she paused, "you make me think I can still tend something." Damon leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon. "You already have. Look around." She followed his gaze, the mended fences, the rows of green beans stubbornly alive in the dry soil, the warm light spilling from the window where her children slept. "This place was dead before you came," he said softly. "Now it breathes again." For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was full, settled, alive. Asha glanced sideways. "Do you ever miss the road?" Damon shook his head. "No. Roads lead away. I've had enough leaving." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe you've finally chosen to stay." The words caught him off guard, a quiet echo of her old song. Damon looked at her, his face lit faintly by the lamp's glow. "Maybe I have." Above them, the night deepened. The stars hung low, silver on black, and for the first time since the war, Damon Pike felt the strange, steady peace of a man who had nothing left to run from. Spring returned to the valley like an old friend who remembered how to smile. The mesquite bloomed pale yellow, and the cottonwoods swayed heavy with new green. Along the ridge behind the cabin, white tufts of cottonseed drifted through the air, soft as snow, but warm, forgiving. Asha walked the fields at dawn, bare feet brushing the wet grass. Each step stirred the smell of earth and life. She carried a basket of beans on her hip, humming the song about the wind that chose to stay. From the porch, Damon watched her, one hand resting on the rail, the other holding his coffee tin. There was something about the way she moved, not cautious anymore, not ready to flee. She belonged to this land now. And somehow, so did he. That afternoon, he asked her to walk with him. They went beyond the corral to the cotton tree near the edge of the property. The same tree that had stood half dead when she first came. Now its branches were white with bloom, bending low in the wind. Damon stopped beneath it, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You ever think about naming this place?" he asked. Asha smiled faintly. "A name gives something roots." He nodded. "Maybe it's time." He reached into his pocket and drew out a strip of red cloth, clean, folded, worn around the edges. "This was part of my cavalry sash," he said. "The only thing I kept. I used to think it meant pride. Now I think it means something else." Asha looked down at the cloth, the color bright against the dust on his hands. "What does it mean now?" Damon hesitated, then met her eyes. "It means I don't want you living under my roof as a debt. I want you here as my wife." The world seemed to still, the wind pausing between breaths, the tree's cotton drifting slower. Asha's lips parted, but no sound came. Then, softly, "You'd marry me, knowing what I am?" He stepped closer, voice low and steady. "I know exactly what you are, a woman who worked this ground into something worth calling home. A mother who faced down hate with quiet grace. Asha, I've seen the worst of men. You remind me what's left of good." Tears shimmered at the edge of her lashes. catching the sun. "If I say yes," she whispered, "I bring my whole blood with me. My people, my ghosts. They will live in your house." Damon reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. "Then let them. A house without ghosts is just wood and nails." She laughed through her tears, a soft, incredulous sound that made the wind stir again. "You talk like an Apache elder," he smiled. "Maybe I'm just a man who's been alone too long." Aisha took the red cloth and tied it gently around his wrist. "Then we'll both belong to the wind that chose to stay." They stood there a while longer beneath the cotton tree, its blossoms falling around them like slow snow. It wasn't much of a ceremony, no priest, no scripture, no crowd, just two hands clasped and a vow carried away by the breeze. Word spread quietly across Red Hollow. Some whispered disapproval. Others shook their heads and said nothing. But a few, Caleb Boone among them, came to stand witness under that cotton tree. His wife Martha brought wildflowers, and Noka held them proudly, her braid tied with a strip of white ribbon. Tyan tugged at Damon's sleeve. "Does that mean you're my pa now?" he asked. Damon smiled, kneeling to the boy's height. "If you'll have me." The boy nodded solemnly. "I will." When Asha joined them, her hand slipped naturally into Damon's happen, and it felt as though it had always been there waiting. Patient. Sure. Years later, the valley changed again. Laws shifted. Men with paper and pens rode through to register land claims. For the first time, Aisha's name was written beside Damon's on a deed Pike homestead. Noka grew tall and steady, Tayan quick and clever. And one spring morning, the house filled with the sound of a baby's cry, a daughter. Her skin like dawnlight, her eyes dark as her mother's. Damon held her with hands that had once held only weapons, his voice shaking when he said, "She's proof." Aisha smiled. "Of what? That this land can heal," he said. Outside, the wind pushed through the open window, stirring the white curtains. The sound was soft, almost like laughter. On a summer morning years later, Asha stood on the porch with the baby asleep in her arms. The field stretched wide before her rows of green, sunflowers nodding toward the light. Noka and Tayan chased each other through the dust, their laughter carrying all the way to the river bend. Damon was fixing a fence post, his shirt clinging with sweat, his shadow long and strong across the dirt. When he looked up, their eyes met not as strangers, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had finally arrived where they were meant to be. Asha looked out at the valley, her valley now, and whispered, "Half to the wind, half to the memory of those who came before her. I did not betray you. I chose to live, and life has kept its promise." The wind stirred her hair, lifted the baby's breath against her chest, and carried the words away, not lost, but planted, like seed in the soil that once refused to bloom. From that day forward, the locals stopped calling it Pike's Ranch. They called it the wind that stayed, and every time the breeze moved through the cotton trees, it sounded a little like a song, the one she used to hum when the world was still learning to forgive.